guys, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today's video is going to be my September and October wrap-up video. So altogether I've got 13 books that I want to talk about today, which is actually quite a lot for me, but a couple of them were really short stories, and one of them did take me quite a few months to read, but I finally finished it in September. So I'm going to go in order from the date that I finished these books. These are the only ones that I actually have physically here. These two in the middle here are library books, and then the others are mine. And then a few of the other books, again, were library books that I've since returned. There was one book that I borrowed off a friend from work, and I've read quite a few of them on ebook and audio as well. So let's just get stuck into the first book. So the first book that I finished in September was Moon Witch Spider King by Marlon James. And I love how I'm kind of matching this book today with the pink. I'm in a very pink mood. This book I think I started in June, so it took me quite a long time to read it, or maybe July. But this is a sequel in the Black Star trilogy, the first book being Black Leopard Red Wolf, which I gave a 5-star. This one, I still enjoyed it, but I didn't enjoy it quite as much as I liked the first book. As I say, it took me a really long time to finish this book, which isn't a bad thing in itself because the first book took me a really long time to read as well, but I really enjoyed savouring that book over a long time, whereas this one felt a little bit like a chore at some points. So this is a fantasy trilogy which is set in a fictionalized version of Africa, which is based on a lot of mythology, and we're following this really bizarre cast of characters as they set off on this quest to find a missing boy. And in the first book we're following this character called Tracker, who has a really powerful sense of smell, and he can literally like sniff out this boy. Whereas in this book we're mainly following the witch who appears in the first book. She's really old, and in the first book you're not sure whether she's like a hero or a villain. So I really did like reading from her perspective, seeing her life story and all of the hardships she'd been through right up until the point of the first novel. I would say that about 400 to 500 pages of this book are all backstory, and then we only get to the events of the first book at about the 500 page mark, I would say. So that was the only point that it like tied into the first book properly, and I didn't like those sections as much as I liked it in the first book because I felt like Sogolon, who's our main character, was largely a bystander in the first book. So to see things from her perspective was interesting, but I felt like I was missing out on the action. It didn't have the same sense of adventure that the first book had, and I really missed those scenes where like the monsters were really terrifying, you didn't know if he was going to get out alive, there was a lot of mystery there. Whereas this book has a lot more like backstory and a lot of lore to it, and not as much action. There is still action, don't get me wrong, but I just preferred it in the first book, I think. The confusing thing about this series is that some of the versions of events are slightly different, so it can be quite confusing to follow at times and you're not sure who you can trust. And although I overall preferred the first book, I still think Sogolon's a really interesting character. I loved seeing her backstory, her romance and everything, and I did like the history and everything that we learned in this book. Like I say, I just missed the action and like the emotional impact that the first one had on me. I will still read the third book, and I did like this one, but I'm going to give it a 3.5 out of 5. Just because it was slightly underwhelming when I think about how much I liked the first book, but it wasn't a bad book by any means. I think the combination of finishing that really long book and also seeing my reading challenge on Goodreads and seeing that I was quite a few books behind really put me in the mood to read some short stories. So on the 6th of September I managed to read 3 short novellas, and that made me feel so good to just knock 3 books off my TBR. So one of the books that I read on that day was Petrified Women by Jeremy Ray. We're following this girl whose boyfriend really likes to prank her, and I really hate pranks, I can't stand them. So it was really interesting to see how like extreme this guy was and how he warned her in advance that he loved pranks and he will be pranking her like all the time, and she was like, yeah, that's fine, until she realizes like how horrible his pranks are. It's like he gets off on making her really terrified, which is kind of disturbing. So our main character on her boyfriend's birthday decides that she's going to prank him, and it's going to be like the biggest prank ever. But then as she's like in the process of setting up this prank, she stumbles across something that she really wishes she hadn't seen, and then the story just goes from there. So this book is only 92 pages and I had a really good time with it. It felt really tense and suspenseful, and I was really nervous about what was going to happen next, and I did connect with our main character quite early on, so I was genuinely like worried about what was going to happen to her. I forgot to mention that this is a horror novella, and that's the side of it that let me down a little bit. So the horror in this book just wasn't that scary to me. I'm not really a fan of the branch of horror that it uses. I'm not going to say what it is because it's only a short book, but I will say that there is sexual violence in this book, and that can kind of be considered a separate branch of horror that this book uses, and I feel like that was done really effectively. But yeah, the conclusion let me down a little bit and I just didn't find it like super scary, but I still enjoyed it for how quick it read and how tense it was, so I'm going to give this book a 3.5 out of 5. The next book I read on this day was Emergency Skin by N.K. Jemisin. The reason that I wanted to read this book is because I have started the 5th season trilogy. I've read the first 2 and I'm yet to read the 3rd one, which I'm hoping to read by the end of this year. And I saw that she'd done the short story, which is really well received. I think it's in a collection with a few other sci-fi authors, but I'm not really interested in those, so I just decided to read this one on its own. This story is only 40 pages and it amazes me how much stuff she manages to fit in to these 40 pages. It's actually quite insane. It's basically told in second person, so it's told to the reader as if we are, I think it's a robot or an alien, I can't remember, who is travelling to a different planet in order to collect some sort of material, but the only dialogue that we hear in the book is this AI which is implanted into us, the main character, telling us what to do. And we also get to see from the people that this alien robot thing encounters when they get to this planet. It's just such a clever story. It's really unique, really interesting, and I thought it was so fascinating how you could understand what the main character is feeling based only on the dialogue that others are saying to him. You don't get anything about your own thoughts and feelings, what you say back. It is purely like what you're being told, and I just love that. There's not much more I can say about this book without spoiling it because it is so short, but I did really like the overall message of it and I've given it a 4 out of 5. And then the last short story that I read on this day was The Grown-Up by Gillian Flynn. This book has been on my TBR for the longest time, basically ever since I read her novels, which was quite a few years ago now. This book is only 64 pages, so I won't go too much in depth about what the plot is, but we're following this main character who has an unconventional career. She started off as a sex worker and she's now doing palm readings, I think, or some other fortune teller kind of job. And this woman basically comes in and asks for her help because she thinks her house is haunted. Unfortunately, this is my least favourite thing that Gillian Flynn's ever written. I thought it started off really well and I was really interested in the mysteriousness of it all, but I think towards the end the reveals were too quick. They U-turned back on themselves because you didn't have time to process it before something else would come up. And I also didn't like the ending. I just wanted a bit more like explanation or a bit more closure or something. So yeah, I thought it had like a really promising start, potentially good middle, and then it just sort of fizzled out for me. So I've ended up giving this one a 2 out of 5, which really upsets me because Gillian Flynn's one of my favourite authors. So I thought I'd really like this one, but unfortunately I didn't. The next full-length novel that I read after this was The Ruins by Scott Smith. So we're following these two sets of couples and the girlfriends are best friends, and they've gone on this holiday to Mexico and they've met a couple of other friends while they're there as well. And then one day one of the boys who they're with says that his brother's missing and he'd gone out into the Mexican jungle and he hadn't come back. So he's gonna go looking for his brother and he asks like if they want to go too, and they all agree to go. So this group all head out into the Mexican jungle. They come across this tribe who live in the area and they can't communicate with them, but they're trying to figure out where this brother has gone. And then they come across this hill which is covered in this vine and end up basically getting trapped on there, surrounded by this tribe who won't let them leave. So we then follow this group as they try to figure out how they're going to leave this hill, how they're going to escape from this tribe, and how they're going to get back home. It's kind of like a survival environmental horror slasher mix-up, and I really loved it. Sometimes this book read quite slowly, but I think it really worked. It's very detailed and descriptive, but I think it mirrored this feeling of being trapped and how drawn out everything would seem. We get the perspectives of each person in the couples. One of them is like super Boy Scouty and he really sets off on like trying to help them all survive, even though it could only be potentially a couple of days. Some get really hysterical, some become really selfish. There's tons and tons of body horror which was so gross and creepy, and it was just so fun. It read like a horror movie, and it's kind of an unconventional horror because it is based on like the environment, and it wasn't like the scariest thing in the world to me, but I felt like the way this book was written was just super terrifying and it was horrible to put yourself in that situation. And then I really love the ending as well, but I did come out of this book feeling like really depressed. And I actually read somewhere that there is a film version of this book, but I saw that they changed the ending of the film because if they'd used the book's ending then it said that people would leave the cinema being so depressed. And yeah, I can see that, but I really enjoyed this book. I'm gonna give it a 4 out of 5 stars. The only reason I'm not giving it a 5 is because it wasn't the scariest thing in the world to me, I guess, and I do want to read more from this author, so the next book I want to read from him is A Simple Plan, so hopefully that one is just as good. But yeah, 4 out of 5 for that one. The next book that I read is potentially one of my favourite books of this year, and that is Notes on an Execution by Danya Kakafka. This book was sensational. It's basically about this serial killer who's currently on death row, and we get to see his perspective on the last 24 hours that he's going to live. But the main part of this story is following 3 different perspectives of 3 different women who were in this serial killer's life, and I thought it was such a brilliant way of telling this story. The writing is just gorgeous and so engaging, and it really sucked me in straight away. I really wish I had a copy of this book because I really want to annotate it, but unfortunately I had it from the library, so I couldn't do that. But this whole book was so emotional and so thought-provoking, and it's really opened my eyes to how we as society view serial killers and the romanticisation of true crime and sensationalizing serial killers and stuff. I don't know, I felt really called out by it, but like in a good way. So I'm really into true crime. I watch crime videos a lot, documentaries, podcasts, that sort of thing, and this book is basically trying to make the point that because people are so interested in true crime, that gets exploited a lot, and a lot of the accounts about serial killers focus on them. They don't really focus on the victim. It did really make me think. So I finished this book just as the Jeffrey Dahmer series was coming out on Netflix, and I'd heard so many good things from like other people that I know who were telling me I should watch it, and I just couldn't like bring myself to watch it, because do we really need another program about Jeffrey Dahmer? Probably not. There's so many documentaries out there, there's so much stuff to read about him already. Why do we need another one? And then I also saw in the news that the victims of Jeffrey Dahmer, the families weren't very happy with how it was being portrayed. And I saw a video of the courtroom scene that's in the show, and then like compared to the real life version of what happened. And I just thought it was so icky that that moment in somebody's life where they are that traumatised and they're just shouting at him like, you've killed my family member, and then that's just kind of been recreated by a TV show for everyone to see. I don't know, there's just something gross about it. Like, I just can't stop thinking about what if something like that happened to one of my family members, and every time a documentary or a TV show or a film came out about the serial killer who'd done it, how that would make me feel. Because just all the media attention that you're getting, all that trauma being brought back up again, just because people like to watch it, which is weird in itself, and I am guilty of it. Like, I watch all sorts of stuff like that, but it did really make me think, like, that's about a real person. That person has a real family that is out there who probably don't want all this stuff to be brought back up again. So yeah, I never ended up watching Jeffrey Dahmer because I just couldn't bring myself to do it. Like, this book has really changed my opinion on true crime, and I'm definitely going to be like way more careful with the stuff that I consume now, and just a bit more mindful of the effect that that has, rather than just binging it, which is something that I do. Like, I will listen to podcasts all the time, and it's literally hopping from one thing to the next. Like, how am I meant to actually process about the victim when I listen to stuff like this as entertainment? So yeah, that's my thoughts on that. This book also talks a lot about the death penalty and about executing people in general, about whether that is beneficial for society, beneficial for anybody really. This book was just on another level. I really loved it, and I also cried at the end, in 2 different parts actually, like 2 very opposite parts as well, so that was interesting. But yeah, this book was definitely a 5 out of 5 and is probably the best book that I've read this year so far. So we'll see, we might be talking about this again in my best books of 2022. The next book that I read is one that I borrowed from a friend at work, and that is The Complete Mouse by Art Spiegelman. This is the first graphic novel that I've read in a long time. I did used to read the Fable ones when I was playing The Wolf Among Us, but aside from that I've never read anything quite like this before. This is a true story about a survivor of the Holocaust. Art Spiegelman, in real life, his dad and his mum were put in concentration camps as they were Jews living in Poland at the time of World War II and Hitler's reign. So in this book we're following Art as he's asking his dad about Hitler's regime and about his experiences with that. We get to see his dad's story, but also this relationship between Art and his dad as he's like asking him these questions about the war. And it's a bit of a strained relationship. They don't always get on very well. As you might expect, this book is a very horrifying read, but I really loved how this was a first-hand account from an actual survivor of the Holocaust, and it wasn't some like sensationalized story, something that's been made up. So it definitely opened my eyes to a lot of the things that I already knew, like the amount of times that Art's dad survives due to luck or due to who he knew or like his skills and things, and just the sheer amount of people who died in every few pages. And it's sickening to think of like how this was real and how this happened in our like grandparents' generation. I just felt it was such an important read. It was really quick because it's this graphic novel. It's a shame I don't have it here now to like show you what it looks like, but the amount of work that must have gone into this book, just like drawing out every single scene, and also the emotional stress that must have gone into this book, not only from Art himself but his dad, their relationship and everything, you really do realise how good you've got it. But it's also important to see what others went through in different periods of history, because it's not even that long ago when you think about it. Because this is a true story, there are parts of it that can feel frustrating because you don't know all the answers, but also like the author, he doesn't have that closure either. This is definitely up there with like one of the best accounts of that time in history that I've ever read, and I gave it a 4 out of 5. It's hard to rate something like this because in terms of like effort, I would say like hands down like 5 out of 5, but I guess my reading experience, I'd say a 4. It's just a personal rating, isn't it? Like it always is. I would definitely recommend this book if you're interested in that time in history, and even if you're not, it's such a good introduction to it because it's very accessible, it's very easy and like quick to read, but also obviously very upsetting. So yeah, I definitely recommend this one if that's something that you're interested in. The next book that I read is a little bit of a throwback to my teenage years, and it's The Grace Year by Kim Liggett. When I was a teenager, I really got into reading because of dystopian novels, The Hunger Games, The Maze Runner, the Delirium series, and like Divergent and all of that stuff. And this book really pays homage to all of that, but also tries to make it a bit more feminist. It has a lot of ties to The Handmaid's Tale, but it's also quite similar to The Lord of the Flies, so I thought this was going to be a really good book for me. I listened to it on audiobook. So our main character, Tierney, lives in a society where women are seen to have this kind of magic which entraps men. So when the girls turn 16, they have this little ceremony where the men can claim them as like their wives, and then the women have to go on their grace year, which is meant to purge them of their magic, and then they can come back, marry the guys that have like proposed to them, and then be like productive members of society. Nobody talks about what happens on the grace year. People come back from it, some people don't. Some people come back with like injuries or like disfigurements and stuff. So we're basically following Tierney and a group of other girls as they go on this grace year. And although I had a good time listening to this book, there are quite a few things that I didn't really like about it. Firstly, as tends to be the case in these kind of books, Tierney is a little bit pick-me vibes. She doesn't really like the other girls, she's a bit different to the other girls. All her friends are guys, which is always annoying to me a little bit. I thought that the rest of the characters in this book weren't well developed at all. All these other girls that Tierney goes on this grace year with are known by like name only, and I found it really hard to be emotionally attached to them and to care about what happened to them when they were literally just sort of there. The only girl who gets a little bit of development is the villain in this book, who's called Kirsten. It's like Kirsten but with an E in it. And oh my god, her voice on the audio was so annoying. It was like a stereotypical American bully, and she was really painful to read from, and she just sounded so like one-dimensional. One thing I did really like about this book is how dark it gets, especially for a YA, and there were a lot of things that were really shocking, but they lacked that emotional impact because you weren't really invested in the characters all that much. There is also a romance going on in this book, which I didn't really care for, but that takes up quite a lot of the book. And lastly, this book is kind of known for its feminist commentary, but I didn't really buy it. It didn't feel very feminist to me. It just felt very similar to the YA dystopians that I read like 10 years ago when I was a kid, and I didn't really see how this book was making any progress on that. However, I did really like the ending. I'm not sure if I'm just not the audience for that kind of book anymore, because I feel like I would have really loved this as a teenager, but overall I thought it was an okay book, so I've given it a 3 out of 5. The next book that I read is actually a manga, and it is Uzumaki by Junji Ito, and this is a book that I got from the library. It is a huge book, but I managed to feed it, and I managed to read it all in one afternoon. So if you've never read manga before, it's basically back to front. So you basically start on like the right hand page and then go to the left and then turn over. And this book has some really incredible art in it. It was so scary, like genuinely terrifying. It's probably one of the scariest books I've ever read. It just has some really horrifying imagery, and I know that I was in for a jump scare. Like if something happened at the end of the right hand page, I'd know that I'd turn the page and there'd be some horrifying image there, and it was so much fun. So this book is about a town which has been cursed by Uzumaki, which is a spiral. So I've never known a spiral to be scary, but it definitely is now. And this book basically tells a variety of different ways in which this spiral has taken over the town and is just sending people into a bizarre frenzy, and it's so good. It has an episodic format to it, so each episode kind of reads like a different element that the spiral has taken over the town, and they kind of felt like little standalones in themselves, but then obviously work together to create this massive like arc of the spiral taking over. It's super quick to read. It did take me a couple of hours, but obviously because it's a lot less words and mainly images, it's quite easy to read. I'm amazed at how many different ways Junji Ito can make a spiral scary, and some of it genuinely made me feel ill because of how gross it was. I do think it got less scary towards the end, but I really enjoyed this book, and I definitely want to read more from this author, and also more manga maybe, because I didn't know I could be scared by just like pictures, but I was. So I've given this book 4.5 out of 5 just because of how it dipped slightly on the scare factor towards the end, but it had a really good ending. I can't really fault it at all. It just doesn't feel like a 5-star, but it's very close. I've dropped the camera like twice now, so sorry if it's in a slightly different position and it's been a bit annoying. The next book that I read, The Secret History by Donna Tartt. This one, as you can probably tell by my little tabs, I really enjoyed. This whole reading experience to me was so good. Basically, I decided to buy some fancy tabs, like some proper tabs. I didn't show you this actually before, but in Moon Witch Spider King, I had like a couple of tabs, and I basically just used like sticky notes and like folded them over, which obviously you can do, but I really wanted some like proper tabs that you could sort of, you know, run your hands across. They're also quite transparent, so you can still see a bit of the text like underneath if I like strain my eyes. I also used a straight up pen in this book, which is shocking, I know. So I'd basically like underline a little bit of the text, put in a little sticky note, maybe add some notes if I wanted to. I've also put like a little key at the front of my book just to say like what each tab means. So I did a tab for really gorgeous setting descriptions, because straight away in this book I tabbed like 5 different pages within the first like 10, just because of how beautiful the setting was described as. Then the next tab was for the members. I haven't even said what this book is about, have I? So, The Secret History is a cult classic dark academia book. We're following this guy called Richard who studies Greek, and he joins this new school where he's fascinated by the other Greek students. There's 5 of them. They're very exclusive, they keep to themselves, and they're trained by this really charismatic professor called Julian. And it's basically about how Richard gets into this group and how their views on life and philosophy send them down a very dark road. So yeah, back to my tabs. So this one here is the Greek class, their character development and their dynamics with each other. I did this one for Julian. I did this one for interesting plot devices. So there were a couple of times where like spoilers almost would be dropped in, and I was like, ooh, that's an interesting time to bring that in. Or I think that was mainly what that tab was for. And then here I've got for Richard, who's our main character, and just about how he kind of fits into it, because for most of this book he is kind of like a bystander. But anyway, I'm rambling. This book I'm going to give a 4.5 out of 5 stars. I loved the writing. The description of settings is just beautiful. I just adore the whole vibe of this book and the whole feeling it gave me. It feels very cozy but also very daunting at the same time. Like, this university sounds gorgeous, and I really loved seeing how this group lived and just their like weird quirks and stuff. Like, whilst everyone else is out drinking and doing drugs, they're drinking like whiskey in this country house because they're all rich and, you know, talking about Greek, talking about classics and all this, and it's just such a fascinating thing to read about. Just like how the other half live, you know? I feel like this book just mesmerised me in a way. Like, I just couldn't stop reading it. I was so engaged, so intrigued by what was going to happen. Even though this book isn't very plot heavy, a lot of it is very character focused. A lot of it is the everyday life of Richard as he's just like going through his time at uni. And yeah, I think I'll remember this book for a long time, just on how immersed I was, how much I enjoyed the process of like tabbing things that I liked, writing my own thoughts in it. And now this copy is like really special to me because it's like, it's mine, isn't it? I've written in it. So my only critique, which isn't even a critique basically because I understand why it was done, there's so much that we don't know. Like, I wanted to know more about how Julian taught his actual classes. I think we only get one where he's actually teaching them anything. So I wanted more of that. I wanted to know what happened at the end. I wanted to know what was said, and I will never know that. But like I say, I understand why it was done, because Richard is a bystander. He's often left out, he's often left in the dark, so then we as the reader are as well. But yeah, I really enjoyed this book, and I think I will give one of her other books a go, maybe The Goldfinch. So if you've read any other Donna Tartt books, let me know which ones I should read, because her writing is just spectacular. The next book that I read as we approached the Halloween October spooky season was A Head Full of Ghosts by Paul Tremblay. This book is about a family where we've got a mum, dad, two sisters, and the older sister is believed to be possessed. And we're mainly following from the perspective of the younger sister as they invite a television documentary crew into their home to basically film what's happening with the older child. So having this show aired allows them to get money and also to access some help. So they think it's quite a good solution to the problem basically. But we're also following the younger sister in the future, and then we're also following this blog post who is doing like a deep dive analysis on the TV show that was filmed. Again, I listened to this on audio. I thought it was okay, but I'm not really scared by possession stuff, and I was sort of hoping that this book would change my mind, but I just don't find it that scary. I was more interested in this family and why they decide to let this crew into their home to film them at all times and basically air what's going on with them to everyone and how this impacts them. That was far more interesting to me, but the horror element of this book was just not really there for me. I also found the blog post really, really annoying. Like, it definitely had some good points in it, and it gives a good picture of how this TV show was actually aired and like what it was like. But the voice that that woman had, oh my god. It wasn't even her voice, like her actual voice, because I know sometimes I like complain about audiobooks because the voice actor was odd, but this wasn't even the case. Like, this blogger's style of writing was just so fake, quirky. There were so many jokes littered throughout it. It was just super annoying for me to listen to. So I didn't really like those sections that much. I was way more interested in the perspective of the younger sister when she was young, when she was like actually going through this where her sister's being possessed. And also the speculation as to whether she was actually possessed or not was interesting as well, or whether she was just suffering from mental health issues. I thought this book was just okay, and then it did get better towards the end. There was a twist that I wasn't expecting, but overall, because I read it wanting to be scared and I wasn't, I did feel a little bit let down by it, so overall I gave it a 3 out of 5. The last book that I have here physically is Fauna by Ottessa Moshfegh. This is another library book, so it has this shiny cover on that I can't take off. This is the first book that I've read by Ottessa Moshfegh, and I'm a bit mixed about this book. So Fauna is a medieval fiefdom, I think is how you say it, similar to a village, where we've got this little village and then there's a lord who lives in this massive manor like up the hill, and we're following a couple of different perspectives from the town. One is from the fiefdom's shepherd and then his son, who is born disfigured. We also follow this older woman who basically was the wet nurse for like everyone in this fiefdom, and men still go to her to nurse on her, so that's odd. This book is kind of gross in some ways, but also not as gross as I expected. I've heard that this book is really disturbing, and I didn't think it was that bad. There's quite a lot of just gross body things in this book, and we basically follow a year in Fauna from a couple of these different characters, and I don't know what it was, but every like 10 to 20 pages I'd find myself so bored and I just want to put this down and read something else. And I don't even know why, because the writing was fine. Like, there was nothing in it that I could say was annoying me. It just wasn't gripping me. It hadn't like hooked me in. It kind of reminded me of The Devil All the Time, which is similar in terms of we're following this like impoverished area. There's a range of different characters who are all very like gross and weird in their own ways, and it's about reading them all doing disturbing things. So it's similar in that way, but I just much preferred The Devil All the Time, and I can't really say why. And when I finished it, I thought, what was the point of that? Like, what was the point? And I've never thought that about a book before, like, why was this written? I think I'm going to give this book a 2.5 out of 5 because I felt like it was very average. I felt like it was kind of surface level. Like, how can I say like a book doesn't have a point to it? But I just finished it and thought like, I don't get it. Like, am I missing something? I thought I would enjoy this much more, and on paper I should have enjoyed it more, but I just didn't like the writing, I don't think. I have got Eileen by the same author, and I'm going to give that a go because she's so like hyped at the minute, just to see if it's just her writing that I don't like or if it was just that one, I don't know. And then the last book that I read, I just finished it a couple of days, I think before October finished, and that was The Murder of Roger Aykroyd by Agatha Christie. So I love crime, thriller, mysteries, and obviously Agatha Christie is the queen of crime, and I've never read any of her books before. The only thing I've ever, I guess, consumed that is Agatha Christie related is, well, firstly that episode of Doctor Who with the wasp, which was fun, I guess. But also, me and my sister used to have this game called, I think it was The Murder on the Orient Express, and it was like an official Agatha Christie story, I suppose. And oh my god, I used to play that so much. But it was like the hardest game ever. We used to have the walkthrough on like a different tab, and we'd have to like keep checking this walkthrough because this game was just so hard. I mean, for our little child brains. So that's the only exposure to Agatha Christie I've ever had, but I'd heard so many good things about The Murder of Roger Aykroyd and how it stands the test of time, and it was a massive turning point for crime fiction at the time. So this book was first published in 1926, which is almost 100 years ago, and it was really enjoyable actually. I loved the language in this book, like they all spoke so nicely to each other and very gentlemanly and stuff. This doctor called James goes to examine a body one day, and then he ends up getting sucked into a bit of a murder mystery, and Hercule Poirot lives in his town, and they approach him and ask him to come out of retirement and help with this case. So we then follow Poirot, obviously the classic Agatha Christie character, and this doctor guy as they try and solve a mystery. I really enjoyed this book. It was very easy to digest. I actually listened to it on audio, but some of this felt like way too clever for me. It was very like thorough and detailed about discrepancies with the crime scene and stuff, and because you're not following Poirot, you're not knowing how his brain works, which I think is a really good choice of Agatha Christie because he's meant to be this like genius, and I quite like that he's separate from the main character and we never quite know what he's thinking in this book, but he'd pick up on the tiniest little things about like shoe prints and the times and the alibis and stuff. And I don't know if it's because I was listening to it on audio or what, but I couldn't really keep up with it. There was no way I was ever going to solve what was happening in this book because it was too clever for me in a way. I really loved that like classic moment where they all gather in a room and Poirot just like comes out with his theories and is like pointing at everyone and the murderer is in this room, and it was just all those vibes and I really loved it. And then the ending of this book, I can totally see why this shook people in 1926 because I was still shook now. It definitely paved the way for today's crime fiction, and I just loved how I read a book that is almost 100 years old. That's probably one of the oldest books I've ever read and finished, because I'm not really into classics, but I can imagine that this felt so fresh at the time and so unique. I think she built the suspense really well. I genuinely didn't know what was coming. I'm stuck between giving it like a 3 to 4 star, maybe a 3.5, because although I enjoyed it, it's kind of forgettable to me now because it is an older book. It's something that I've seen similar now, but I can imagine people at the time were absolutely blown away by this book, and to be fair, it's still really good. It still stands the test of time. I've read a lot of thrillers and I still thought this was really good, so maybe I'll give it, yeah, I'll give it a 3.5 out of 5, but I would definitely recommend it if you want to read some Agatha Christie or just any like older crime fiction, any classics. That's definitely one to go for. And that, my friends, is all of the books that I have to talk about in today's video. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Let me know in the comments what you've been reading the last couple of months, if you've read any of these books before and what you thought of them, and what you're going to be reading before the end of 2022. So I just posted a autumn TBR, which is probably going to spill into like winter as well. So if you want to see more about what I'm going to be reading soon, then check that video out. I think my next video is going to be a horror reading vlog, so subscribe if you want to see that, and I will hopefully see you in my next video. Bye!